So first of all, welcome back to everyone. Thank you for joining me again. I'm sorry I needed to take a few weeks of a break, but here we are. And we last finished in part 1, chapter 32, and we're about to start chapter 33. And because the book that Maimonides is writing is so disorganized by design, each chapter stands alone. So it's fine if you don't remember what we were studying last time, because we'll start with a new idea. So it's all good. So if you have chapter 33 open in the Pines, it's page 70, chapter 33. There's a lot of really cool stuff that we're going to do today. I hope to do 33 and get well into 34, and we'll hopefully have some interesting things to learn. So for starters, Rambam begins describing why before one understands the themes in this book, which are the ideas that Rambam is trying to teach us, namely what he calls the spiritual ideas, the science of spiritual science, the science of knowledge of God, and all of the ideas that Rambam wants to teach us. You need to have a lot of a background basis learning first, and that's what he's about to describe. You can't just jump to the end. You have to go through the process. It's a long process. This is something that is particularly relevant today, but has been relevant throughout history. People always want the simple, quick, soundbite style answers to questions. And Rambam is going to teach us. And one thing that's very clear is that you cannot take the soundbite route to learning things. You don't get wisdom by someone just telling you, just give me the facts, the bottom line. That's just not how knowledge works. That's not how knowledge is achieved. That's just not what happens. So let's see what he says. I'm going to sort of read through in the English, but as my usual style, I'll paraphrase here and there as we go through it. So first of all, chapter 33, know that to begin with this science is very harmful. I mean the divine science. To just simply start learning by learning all of these lofty philosophical principles is a bad way to go about it. In the same way, it is also harmful to make clear the meaning of the parables of the prophets and to draw attention to the figurative senses of terms used in addressing people, figurative senses of which the books of prophecy are full. Here, Rambam is saying something really important. If you were to start explaining to a person when he or she is young, or he or she doesn't know anything about the Torah yet, and start explaining the deeper meanings of the parables of the Torah rather than their simple, plain surface meaning, you would end up in a dangerous place. So if you start off by telling someone the Torah is all just parables, it's all, but it has a deeper meaning, a deeper message, without having them go through the process of getting there, it could be dangerous. Why is that? It behooves rather to educate the young and to give firmness to the deficient in capacity according to the measure of their apprehension. Now, I'm going to say here clearly what Rambam means.
Wow.
Yes? I'm going to say here clearly what Rambam means, and you'll see as we develop the idea why I'm so sure this is what he means. And that is that for many people, it's better for them to remain with a simple level of understanding of Torah, a surface level, right? A surface level that just simply understands the miracles as stated as is, the stories as stated as is. For example, even Genesis, as is, God created the world in 7 days. Let them think that. It's better that way, rather than start explaining loftier ideas. And we're going to get to this, why the Rambam says this is important. I want to point out here something that a lot of Maimonidean scholars write. When you read modern scholars, they often write about the following question. And that is that Rambam is famous for writing this book, but he's also famous for many, many, many other things. Among them, the codification of the 13 principles of faith, or what some people call the 13 Ani Mammons. I believe that God is one. I believe that God, and Rambam lays it out in an extremely simplistic basic way, as if you're supposed to believe these things without reasoning, without achieving that knowledge, without coming to that knowledge. And even if those pieces of knowledge may contradict fact, that's at least what it sounds like, right? When someone says that this religion teaches you have to believe A, B, and C, right? That means I believe it no matter what. And that's so different from the Rambam that comes out of the pages that we've been reading together. How do you make those two things jive? How could they both be coming from the pen of the same person? A lot of Maimonidean scholars, and I know Menachem Kellner, I've quoted him several times, who's written numerous books on the Rambam, writes this, and many other scholars write this, and that is that the purpose of codifying the principles of faith in simple manner in the 13 principles is because many people of the public can't go through the process of learning, don't have the foundations of understanding to achieve that knowledge on their own, to come to it by work, by contemplation, by study, and so on. They just want to know the bottom line. And Rambam is saying it's okay for those people to understand the Torah on its simple level. And it's better than that they should pretend that they go through the process, but not genuinely go through a process. I kind of give you a hint as to what Rambam is about to say, because if you go through the process but don't do it honestly, you can end up in all kinds of crazy places. And I think you can imagine why that is. So therefore, I'm going to continue now at the top of page 71. Thus, he who is seen to be perfect in mind and to be formed for that high rank. In other words, a person who has the achievement, that is to say, he has the abilities and the mental capacity and the educational level, he should be elevated step by step, either by someone who directs his attention or by himself until he achieves his perfection. A person that can get there, a person that can do that, that person is a kind of person who needs to be taught or who needs to study on his own. If, however, he begins with a divine science, if he's going to start with all of these lofty ideas, right, it will not be a mere confusion in his belief that will befall him, but rather absolute negation. He's going to think it's all a bunch of baloney. He's going to end up he's not going to really understand it. He has to have all that scientific background first. Otherwise, the ideas that he achieves won't make any sense, and he'll end up rejecting them. In my opinion, an analogous case would be that of someone feeding a nursing child bread and meat and giving him wine to drink. He would die from that, not because those are bad foods for a human being, but because the child needs milk, right? So similarly, these true opinions were not hidden, enclosed in riddles, and treated by all men of knowledge with all sorts of artifice. In other words, all of these things we find in the Torah were written in the way that they are, not because the true ideas that underlie all those words are bad ideas or wrong ideas, but because, right, in other words, not because of something bad hidden in them, or because they undermine the foundations of the law. Or some people think that if we really knew what was going on, then we would just prove the whole thing not true, right? You can read biblical critics do this all the time. If we get to the bottom of the text and we read behind the text and we read what it really means, you see that it's all not true. The whole religion is not true, right? It's all just a cultural thing or whatever, something like that. But as is thought by ignorant people who deem that they have attained a rank suitable for speculation, as thought by those, right, who think they understand the Torah better than what the Torah is really trying to teach. Rather, they have been hidden because at the outset, the intellect is incapable of receiving them. When you first open the Torah, when you first open the book, when you're a young child, presumably, or if you're introduced to the Torah later in life, when you first open it, you have to read what it says. Only flashes of them are made to appear so that the perfect man should know them. There are ways that if you analyze a person who's already achieved that level will get the hint and see beyond them. However, on this account, they are called secrets and mysteries of the Torah, as we shall make clear. The Rambam is going to pound this fact into us in several different ways, so it'll get clearer and clearer as we go through it. This is because of the fact that Torah speaks in the language of sons of man, as we have made clear. Rambam already used this term. The Torah speaks in a language that a simple person can understand. This is so because, and remember that Rambam lived in a time when it was okay to to be sexist. So he considers women to be intellectually inferior. So please don't quote me on saying this, but it's presented in a manner to make it possible for the young, the women, and all people to begin with it and learn it. The Torah is written in a way that everyone can understand the basic ideas. Now, it is not within their power, those people, the young, the women, etc. It's not with their power to understand these matters as they truly are. So therefore, they are confined to accepting tradition with regard to all sound opinions. So therefore, they can accept the basic ideas of tradition, such as there is one God, such as God created the world, such as there's reward and punishment. The simple basic ideas that the Torah wants us to know and understand, the Torah puts out there so that every simple person can understand it. That they should be pronounced true and with regard to all representations of this kind. It is this Rambam which is the basis for all of those Maimonidean scholars that describe that, what the question that I started with. Why is it that the Rambam could write 13 principles of faith in such simple way at the same time as he writes all of these deep philosophical ideas? It just doesn't work. Rambam is telling us here right now that for those simple people, it's better that they just know the basic facts than that they go through this whole process of learning it. Because, and as he will continue to explain, and this is in such a manner that the mind is led towards the existence of the objects of these opinions and representations, but not towards grasping their essence as it truly is. So those people will now know the facts, the basic facts of faith, the basic ideas that the Torah wants you to know, and that's it, without having gone through the process so that they can really, really, really get it. Only the people that go through the process are the ones that really do get it. And he's going to explain soon. However, when a man grows perfect and the mysteries of the Torah are communicated to him either by somebody else or because he himself discovers them, when he does that, inasmuch as some of them draw his attention to others, he attains a rank at which he pronounces the above mentioned correct opinions to be true. Then when he says God is one, or then when he says that a human being cannot comprehend God, or then when he says that God created the world, or whatever principle it is that he's stating, right? For him, and in order to arrive at this conclusion, he uses the methods, namely demonstration in cases where demonstration is possible or strong arguments is possible. In other words, he can scientifically show you, he can show you how the world works and how he achieved this knowledge, right? Or he can give you the arguments and the logic by which he came to this knowledge, right? Or explain to you the process, how he got there, right? That person, right? In this way, he represents to himself these matters which had appeared to him as imaginings and parables in their truth and understands their essence. I need to put this on pause for just 1 second. I'm sorry about the break there. Thank you for your patience. We're just up to the fact that when a person achieves that level, right? Then he understands it in the truth and in their essence. Accordingly, the following speech of the sages has been repeated to you several times in our speech. In other words, we mentioned this. The account of the chariot, which Rambam is said, and we learned this way back in the beginning, is referring to knowledge of spiritual matters, ought not to be taught even to one man, except if he be wise and able to understand by himself. Teach it to the person that's actually going to go through the process of learning and has the capacity to do so. On this account, one ought not to begin to teach the subject to anyone unless it be according to his capacity, and then only under these two conditions, one of them being that he is wise, meaning, and Rambam says, I mean that he has achieved knowledge of the sciences from which the premises of speculation derive. And he's going to go into what does he mean exactly by the sciences. I'll explain that in the next chapter. And the other, that he be full of understanding, intelligent, sagacious by nature, that he divine a notion, even if it is only very slightly suggested to him in a flash. Okay, so he has good understanding, he's able to derive one fact from another, etc. This is the meaning of the dictum, able to understand by himself. I shall make clear to you the cause that prevents the instruction of the multitude. So here Rambam is about to say, and I'll just paraphrase this last chapter, I'm about to explain to you, why is this true? And what kind of process do you need to go through? And this is where it gets much more, even more interesting. So first, chapter 34. What are the reasons why a person, you can't just tell someone spiritual knowledge and they just know it? Why do they have to go through a process, and what process do they have to go through? So the causes that prevent the commencement of instruction with divine science. The reason why you can't start with these ideas are 5. There's 5 reasons. The first is pretty straightforward. The difficulty, subtlety, and obscurity of the matter in itself. It's hard. It's hard knowledge. It takes a lot to understand it. It's not easy. Thus, Scripture says that which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find out, right? So that's the first one. And also it says, so where do you find knowledge from? Wisdom, where shall it be found? Now, it is not fitting in teaching to begin with what is most difficult and obscure for understanding. One of the parables generally known in our community is the likening of knowledge to water. We find throughout the Talmud that the Talmud compares Torah knowledge to water. And and so, for example, one of them being that he who knows how to swim, if you can swim in water and you can dive down and bring up pearls from the sea, you can enjoy beautiful views of the wonderful wildlife in the water, you can do all kinds of beautiful things from the water if you know how to swim. But if you don't know how to swim, you drown. And for this reason, no one should expose himself to the risks of swimming except if you're trained in learning how to swim. So it's the same thing with this knowledge. If I give you this knowledge, it's hard, it's tough. You need to know how to use it. You need to know how to get it. The second reason why is the insufficiency of the minds of all men at their beginnings, right? People, even a smart person, before he or she learns anything, right? They don't have the ability yet to get it. For man is not granted his ultimate perfection at the outset. Perfection exists as a potential, right? In his beginnings, he lacks this act. Accordingly, it is said, and as man is born a wild ass. A person is born just, with the capabilities of a baby, doesn't have it yet. You have to train him. He has to learn. He has to get there. Nor is it necessarily obligatory in the case of every individual who is endowed with something in potency. In other words, it just because you have the potential, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will become actual. A lot of us may have potentials that we will never actualize, either because we never were aware or because we were too lazy to do it, or no one approached us or no one taught us or whatever. But just because you have the potential doesn't mean it'll happen. Sometimes it remains in its defective state, either because of certain obstacles or because of paucity in training, right? In other words, nobody teaches you. Accordingly, it is clearly said, not many are wise. The sages too say, I saw the people who have attained a high rank, and they were few. For the obstacles to perfection are very many, and the objects that distract it from it abound. When should he be able to achieve the perfect preparation and the leisure required for training? Some people, are stuck in a life situation where they never have time to get that intellectual education that would allow them to bring this into actuality. So what subsists in a particular individual in potency should be transformed into actuality, right? Who knows if it ever happens? So that's another issue. The third cause, and this is, Rambam is going to go into this at length, and let's discuss this. This is going to, let's see what he has to say here. The third cause lies in the length of the preliminaries. There's a lot you need to do first. And this is extremely interesting and telling as to Rambam explaining to us what are the preliminaries. I want you to think on your own for just a moment. But if you have looked already ahead, then fine. But if you haven't, don't. And think for a minute, what do you think are the preliminaries to knowing and understanding the Rambam's philosophical ideas of God? I'm going to open the table and see if anyone wants to venture a guess.
Mathematics.
Very good. Very good. That is one. Yeah.
Oh.
What else? That is definitely one of them.
Okay.
Forgive me if my cat's trying to get into
okay,
the.
Since I'm on a roll here, I'll put out physics, movements, objects.
Okay. Yeah. That's there. Movements. He emphasizes more of the movements of the heavenly spheres and the.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay.
Not car mechanics, but yeah.
Yeah. What else might be important?
Okay, I'll stop because I'm ahead.
Okay. Anyone else want to venture to take a guess? There's really one other area that's really important. And I guess you can take courses on this in college for sure. but if no one's going to guess, then we'll wait to see what he says. Anyone else want to take a shot? All right, then. Well, I'll give you a logic, right? How to think, logic, right? But first he's going to explain. For a man in his nature has a desire to seek the ends, right? Everyone wants to know the bottom line, right? Everyone, just tell me, what's the facts? How does it work, right? And you know, that's what everyone wants. And he often finds preliminaries tedious and refuses to engage in them. Everybody wants a beautiful, table, but who's going to spend the time to build one, right? So you make money and you go buy one, right? Everyone wants, to be a wealthy man, but who is willing to spend the time it takes to work, to establish a business, to go through, to pay all the taxes, and to treat your employees right, and find the right place to build a business, the right style to build it? Who's going to go through all of that? Everyone wants to just win the lottery, right? Know, however, that if an end could be achieved without the preliminaries that precede it, right? If you could get to the end without going the process to get there, then the latter, in other words, would not be preliminaries, but pure distractions and futilities. It would be useless to go through the process, right? If everyone could be rich by winning the lottery, then all of that work that you do, that's just a useless waste of time, right? Now, if you would awaken a man, even though he were the dullest, you wake a person as one awakens a sleeping individual. You go to some guy in the street, he could be the least intelligent person you've ever come across, right? If you were to ask him, do you want to know about the heavenly spheres, namely how many there are and how they are set up, right? What is contained in them? Do you want to know all about the stars and the galaxies? That would be a way we would introduce that today, and the planets and the solar system. If you want to, do you want to know what is an angel? How do angels are? What are angels? How do they work? Or you want to know how was the world created? Do you want to know how God created the world? Or what its end is in view of the arrangement of its various parts with another, right? And where the world is going. What is a soul, right? How was it created in time in the body? What can a human soul be separated from body? In other words, all these ideas, right, that we're going to be dealing with as we go through this book, right? And if it can, in what manner and through what instrument, with the distinction of how it's done, what's the process by which it's done, right? What's the purpose of doing it? If you would put the same question to him with regard to other subjects of research of this kind, he would undoubtedly answer, of course, say, yeah, sure, I want to know, right? He would have a natural desire to know these things as they are in truth. He would want to know, but he would wish this desire to be allayed. He wants you to tell me, okay, I know, tell me the answer, right? Give it to me, right? One quick 45-minute lecture on YouTube, that's about the extent of what I'm going to do. To go through, like, this is lecture number 25 for us, that he's not willing to do. If, however, you would lay upon him the obligation to abandon his occupation for a week's time, tell him, all right, well, you need to go to a week-long seminar and stop working for a week until he should understand it, he wouldn't do it, right? He would rather, but would be satisfied with deceptive imaginings through which his soul would be set at ease. He'd rather have you tell him a couple of facts, and now he's, okay, now I know. He can walk away thinking he knows it all now, right? He would also dislike being told that there is a thing whose knowledge requires many premises and a long time investigation. He'd even get upset with you if you told him it's a long story. I can't just give you the quick version. There is no quick version. It just simply doesn't exist. I can't just give you the bottom line. That's not how it works, right? You know that these matters are mutually connected. There being nothing in what exists besides God may be exalted, and the totality of the things he has made. And why is this true, Rambam is saying? Because how do we know about God? How do we learn about God? How do we get to the knowledge of God, right? There's only two categories of things in this world. There's God, and there's everything else that God created, right? And the only thing that we have access to, right, for this totality includes everything comprised in what exists except only him. Everything that he created, right, is the only thing that we have access to. There is, moreover, no way to apprehend him except be it through the things he has made. We can't access God by looking at God because we can't, right? The only way we can access any knowledge about God is by looking at his world, okay, right? By looking at the things around us. For they are indicative of his existence and of what ought to be believed about him. I mean to say, of what should be affirmed and denied with regard to him, right? We see things in our world and we might say, this is not true of God, right? This, we might look at the world and come to understandings of God. But that's the point. The only thing we can look at is the world that's around us. It is therefore indispensable to consider all beings as they really are, so that we may obtain for all the kinds of beings true and certain premises that would be useful to us in our researches pertaining to the divine science. It's therefore, there is no other way. It's indispensable. We must consider the entire creation. This is really important, incredibly profound idea that to understand God, we have to look at the entire world around us. The very notion that there's debates where people say science versus religion, Rambam would look at you as if you were lunatic, you're crazy if you even mentioned that there's some sort of conflict between the two. Without looking at the world around us, without knowing the science of the biology and the mathematics and the physics, the things that are around us, it is impossible to know God. It's indispensable. You cannot learn about God without knowing about the world. Separating yourself from the world is the polar opposite of Maimonidean philosophy. So I'm saying this because there are so many people that misunderstand this idea. So I not so much the people that are listening to this lecture, but think about this. Think about this really strong. When people say I'm separating from myself this world and I'm just studying Torah, they are doing the polar opposite, the exact opposite of what Maimonides is teaching us you're supposed to do. The only way to reach God is through learning about the world. How very many are the premises thus taken from the nature of numbers and the properties of geometrical figures, right? So here Jeff mentioned, mathematics. If we need to know numbers, we need to know how mathematics works. We need to know how geometry works, from which we draw inferences concerning things that we should deny with respect to God. Meaning, from these numbers, we learn characteristics that don't apply to God. And I'm emphasizing this a few times, and we'll see this more and more develop, is by understanding what is, we also, by describing what God is not, we get closer and closer and closer to understanding what he is, right? And this denial is indicative to us of many notions, right? In other words, by denying certain properties of God, by saying geometric figures, God is not a square, God is not a triangle, God is not a circle, God is not a human form, all of those things, we teach many things to ourselves about God. As for the matters pertaining to the astronomy of the spheres and to natural science, right? To understanding astronomy, to understanding how the stars work, to understanding how the sun and the moon works, to understanding, right, natural science, understanding how biology works. I do not consider that you should have any difficulty in grasping that those are matters necessary for the apprehension of the relation of the world to God's governance, as this relation is in truth and not according to imaginings. In other words, if you really want to understand God, you have to look at the stars. You have to look at the sun. You have to look at the moon. You have to understand them. You have to study them. You have to understand the geometry. You have to understand the mathematics. You got to get science if you're going to understand God. There are also many speculative subjects that, although no premises can be obtained from them for the use of this science, there are other subjects where, even though you might not learn ideas like I was just teaching you before, right? Nevertheless, train the mind and procure. There are other things which he's going to mention, like logic, right? That train your mind to infer, to train your mind to reason, train your mind to understand. What modern day we would call it the scientific method. Rambam called it logic, right? And just to know how you infer one thing from another, this trains your mind so that when you look at the world around you, you can eventually conclude and get to the place where you want to get. They also put an end to the confusion in most of the minds of those engaged in speculation. By training your mind, you prevent yourself from getting into the confusion being the place where people go when they're not trained properly, where they don't go through this process. A confusion mistaking things that are accidental for those that are essential. Accidental, Rambam means everything has its essence, right? We've been through this a couple of times. Accident means something that happens to be a quality of a certain object that doesn't make up its essence. The word accident, it doesn't fit well in the way we speak and use the word in modern English, but that's what he's referring to. So hereby an end is also put to the perversion of opinions arising out of this confusion. If we go through this process properly, then you'll avoid the whole mess of all this confusing mess of people making things up and saying things that don't make sense, saying things that are nonsense. All this is achieved in addition to the representation of these subjects as they really are, even if they in no way belong to the divine science, even if you're going through just simple logic, simple training about how to think, right? And even if it has nothing to do, you don't get any godly ideas from it, it's still important to train your mind to think. These subjects are also not devoid of utility in other points, namely with respect to matters that lead up to that science. Accordingly, it is certainly necessary for whoever wishes to achieve human perfection to train itself at first in the art of logic, then in the mathematical sciences according to the proper order, then in the natural sciences, and after that in the divine science. We find many people whose mind stops short at one of these sciences, and sometimes even if their mind does not miss the mark, they are cut off by death while engaged in some preliminary study. So unfortunately, not everyone makes it to that point. We don't all live that long. He's giving you a hint to get you to understand that it's when he says a long process, that week-long seminar that you have to take off of work for is by far not enough, right? It's a lifelong endeavor. And that's why Rambam is saying that the lifelong endeavor, we might get there, maybe when we're 70, 80, 90, 100, whenever it is, but it's a lifelong endeavor that never ends. Accordingly, if we never in any way acquired an opinion through following traditional authority, right? And we're not correctly conducted towards something by means of parables, right? So based on what I'm saying, Rambam is saying now, if we never had been told, right? One way of teaching someone, the simple way, the 13 principles of faith way, is a person of authority. Rambam himself tells you, these are the bottom line ideas, right? That you need to know, right? But if you didn't acquire a position that way, and you were also not correctly conducted towards something by means of parables, but you were obliged to achieve a perfect representation by means of essential definitions, and by pronouncing true only that which is meant to be pronounced true in virtue of a demonstration, right? In other words, you achieve this knowledge by proof, by proving it, by studying it over and over again and going through the facts and proving it to yourself and proving it to others, right? This state of affairs would lead to all people dying without having known whether there is a deity for the world or whether there is not. No one would ever get there, right? Much less whether a proposition should be affirmed with regard to him or a defect denied. Nobody would ever be saved from this perdition except one of a city or two of a family. What Rambam is saying here is crucial. This is why many people need to accept it from a traditional authority. This is why the simple person who can't go through this process needs to be told, these are the things you're supposed to believe. These are the ideas. Because most people can't go through all of this. So they need to just know, what am I supposed to believe? Rabbi, what am I supposed to believe? Is there a God? Yes, there's a God. Who created the world? God created the world. Okay, fine. Now you know, good, right? But then there are others that are working their way towards getting the knowledge that Rambam is trying to teach us in this book. There are others that got there because they worked their way through, because they studied the science, they studied the world around them, they observed things, they learned things, and so on until they achieved it. Solomon has made it clear that the need for preliminary studies is a necessity, and that it is impossible to attain true wisdom except after having been trained. For he says, if the iron be blunt and he do not whet the edge, then must he put to more strength, but even more preparation is needed for wisdom. In other words, to make a sword, it's not going to work unless you sharpen it, unless you melt it properly, you set it properly. But if you're trying to prepare for wisdom, you can't just know something. You have to work your way to get there. I'm going to stop here for now. Well, maybe we can do a little bit more. There is also a necessity of another kind for achieving knowledge of the preliminary studies. It arises from the fact that when a man seeks to obtain knowledge quickly, many doubts occur to him, and he moreover quickly understands objections. I mean, let's do this next time. I'm going to stop here for now. So just to summarize real quick, Rambam is explaining to us why we need to go through a process, and he laid down in a pretty beautiful way what that process has to be. And I know I kind of emphasize the things that speak to me. And one of the primary ones here that comes out of this in such a clear and such a forcefully spoken way is that to think that you can understand God without understanding his world, his physical world that he created and gave to us, means you will never understand God. You can't. One thing cannot be achieved without the other. The only way, and this is an extremely basic Jewish concept, you cannot hide yourself in a monastery on a mountaintop and think that you're going to get to knowledge, unless maybe if you're out wandering out in the mountains and seeing the world around you, then yes, you can do it. But you cannot separate yourself from the world and thus achieve spiritual knowledge. The only way to achieve spiritual knowledge, according to Rambam, and this is an extremely basic Jewish idea, and Rambam is laying out here very, very clearly, is to engage with science, engage with the world around you, understand it, learn it, know it. Then you can maybe, if you don't die young, get to the point where you understand God, ideas of God. I'll stop here and I'll open the floor for comments.
Am I correct that under this analysis in a population, let's say America has 300 million people, let's say 7 million Jews, that maybe we can find 10 Jews that are capable of understanding this graph, maybe only one, and we're looking at them.
No, maybe all 10 are in this class now.
I'll accept that. But I mean, isn't it a kind of a sense that attaining the kind of understanding and wisdom that he's letting out here is confined to an extraordinarily small number of people?
It shouldn't necessarily be, because what the Rambam said, a lot of people have potential that they never bring out. Yes, there are some people, that's maybe a lot, maybe a majority of people that just won't either because they can't, or they just won't. They're just not interested in putting the work in. But there's certainly, and then there are people that will achieve great high levels, and those will be few and far between. But there's definitely a large middle ground of people that can, if they put themselves to it, and those are the people that we're training, and those that are coming to this class are hopefully trying to get there, and those are the people that are saying, I may have potential, and the only way I'll actualize that potential is by working on it, is by getting there.
Okay.
Anyone else have a comment they want to say, a question?
I have a question. You mentioned three subjects: logic, mathematics, and I guess physics, or not you, but somebody did.
Natural sciences is how that should be stated.
Natural sciences. Okay. Ordinarily, would you say that the logic is necessary for and applicable to both natural sciences and mathematics, so that it precedes, a knowledge of logic precedes both of those other subjects which you mentioned?
But there was no implication of sequential. I think it wasn't a sense, am I correct, that it's not a sequential 1, 1, 1? You do all three or however many in a parallel way.
Saul, you're muted, so we can't hear you.
I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize. But yeah, I think that accurately represents what Rambam is saying, and I agree that it's not necessarily all sequential, and logic is necessary, like Rambam said, in order to know any what he called divine science, you need to understand how to think. You need to know logic. And that would be true for any of the sciences. If you don't know how to think, then you're not going to get anywhere.
So is he advocating that we study, say, Aristotelian logic first, and then go on to study his works, or what? Or am I missing the boat here?
Kind of. I think, yeah, he would agree. Like, remember in the letter that he began with all the way back when, in our first lecture, when he was writing a letter to his student, he said his student needed to study mathematics. He needed to show his abilities in logic first before Rambam felt that he was worthy of moving on to that next step. Unless you want to stay with the simple level and just accept it on authority from some, authoritative intellectual figure. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to just sort of, and so the Rambam is suggesting that that you really need to know logic and the sciences before studying religion, or
Yes, that's exactly what he was saying. Right. Yes.
uh,
You can start off knowing the basic religious concepts, but if you really want to know religion, if you really want to understand God, you have to know science first. That he said that very clearly. I'm not, I'm not paraphrasing. I'm not using my own words. Rambam made it as strong a statement as possible to that effect.
Well, how come the yeshivas don't have good courses in mathematics and natural sciences?
Well, how come the yeshivas often don't teach the guide for the perplexed? Because they're afraid of what Rambam has to teach.
Okay.
The Rambam very, very, very forcefully states, and he said it repeatedly, and he said it in this chapter, what we just read today. This is why I emphasized it, because there are people that will try to convince you that the Rambam doesn't feel this way, but there are people that clearly never read the Rambam's actual words. And he made it extremely clear that if you want to understand God, you got to know science. It doesn't mean that we all have to be, an Einstein level physicist, right? Obviously he didn't mean that. That's, but he means you have done the way to achieve spiritual knowledge is through understanding the world. The only way to achieve understanding of God is by studying his creations. And those were the Rambam's words. That's all he gave us access to. He didn't give us access to understanding him, right? We can't understand him. He gave us access to his creations. So if he wants us to achieve knowledge, then we need to look at his creations. And then, of course, then we'll understand when we read the Torah, those little hints that Rambam says. You'll read a verse and you won't take it for its surface value. You'll see, whoa, there's something deep here. And you'll have the wisdom and intelligence to understand what the Torah is really saying.
So how would you respond to an answer that I got when I asked a teacher, a distinguished local rabbi of a Black Hat congregation, about whether he had read Guide to the Perplexed? And his reaction was, I'm not perplexed. I don't have any questions of this nature. How would you answer this distinguished? Sadly, he's passed away.
He's a lucky guy. He has got no questions. That's pretty good. If he can go, listen, if it works for him, I'm not going to sit and argue. But unfortunately for me, I'm stuck with lots and lots of questions. And that's why I took the book out, because and by the end of the book, we'll still be perplexed. But it's okay. But we have a guide, a way to deal with being perplexed.
How will the Rambam's method of learning science explain phenomena like the Shoah?
You're not the first person to ask this question in this forum. And how evil could exist in this world is an issue that Rambam will deal with. It's a big subject, though. But the very, very short version is something along the following, and that is that God created a world of free choice where human beings can do terrible evil. But that's just a very short version. But exactly how that works philosophically, I promise. If we stick with this for a couple of years, when I get to lecture number 67, Rambam does deal with that at much more length than what I just said.
Can you guarantee it will be before we die?
No, can't even guarantee that. Sorry.
I was hopeful, because that could be a long life.
Yeah. And the thing is that like Rambam said, some things, and which we learned to the previous lecture, the last one I gave before I took a break, where he talks about certain things we can never understand. And if we try to understand them, and that to some degree are some of these kinds of issues, is why, the sense of justice in this world that doesn't match what we believe a sense of justice is supposed to be, is one of those things that we'll never understand, and by trying to understand that, Rambam talked about that. That's where Elisha went wrong. Elisha ben Avuya went wrong, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva accepted the suffering that he was put through, despite the fact that he knew he'll never understand it. Elisha looked at suffering, in the world and said, I don't understand it, and therefore he rejected God. And Rambam gave us a hint that the way the only way to understand that is to know that you don't understand, and we never will understand how God works. So he dealt, to that level, he dealt with that, in that last one. But yeah, ultimately we'll never know the answers to these questions, although we can try. But it's a very good question. Anything else before we sign off for today? Anyone else want to contribute? If not, this time when I'm going to post the clean letter, I'm going to post the recording. I'm going to try to cut out that spot where I had to leave. I really appreciate your patience, because I have to head to the hospital now. So we're all good.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Yeah.
Have a good evening. Bye.
Right.
Thank you.